If you've seen some of my other videos, you probably know I like to use visuals or graphics to better understand concepts myself and then to explain them here. And more recently, I've been on a quest to find a common visual language I can use to represent the way electronic instruments structure the musical content on them, like the relationship of samples and sounds at the bass level to the tracks, patterns, sequences, songs, and projects, for example. I'm finding it useful as I develop this language to put it to the test by comparing devices, and I think the structure of the content often starts defining the workflow on each device, and then of course the features that the manufacturer builds in really defines the full workflow options that we have when we're making music. In a prior video, I dared to compare the Teenage Engineering EP133 to the Roland SP404 Mark II, two sampler sequencers that are sold at $300 and $500 respectively. So that comparison begs the question, are the features of the more expensive device worth that extra expense, in that case $200 more? So using a similar structure in this video, I'll be comparing two devices at even lower price points. The Korg Volca Sample2, which is about $149, and the Roland Aira Compact T-8, which is a $199 device, brand new. Both of these devices are part of a family of similar devices from each manufacturer, which I'm sure each manufacturer hopes you buy into that whole family. For Korg, the Volca series includes the Volca Beat, the Volca Bass, the FM, the Volca Keys, the Modular, the New Bass, and of course, the Volca Sample and Sample2. For Roland, the Aira Compact series includes the S1 Tweak synthesizer, the J6 Chord Synth, the E4 voice tweaker, and then of course the T8 beat machine, which we'll see here. It wasn't immediately obvious which device from each family I should compare, as they all have their specialties, so I figured I'd start with one from each family that I really find useful in many situations, and that are somewhat comparable without being too specialized. That said, I realize they are pretty different at the core, like one is a sampler and the other is a synth, but if someone was looking for a general purpose sequencer for laying down song ideas or creating simple patterns, both of these devices should be considered, especially if you're looking for something with some mobility. It's small and light. And the other Volcas and Aira Compacts might get their turn to be compared in later videos. Let's start with the structure of content on both devices. Sticking with the common visuals I'm trying to construct, we'll start at the project level. The Korg Volca doesn't have the concept of projects. The main construct on the Korg Volca is patterns, and you can create 16 patterns. Within each pattern, you have 10 tracks, each of which can hold one of your choice of 200 sounds. And within each pattern, you can have 16 steps. The Roland T8 follows a similar basic structure, which is one reason I felt these two devices can be compared. There is no project construct on the T8, but you have 64 patterns you can create organized across 4 banks of 16 patterns each. Within each pattern, you have 7 tracks. This is where the T8 becomes opinionated. There are 6 rhythm or drum tracks, and each basically has a pre-assigned sound, with slight variations available on a couple of those tracks. The sounds are from the TR 808, 909, and 606, so they're somewhat legendary, just not a lot of choices among those. And there's one, I'll call it melodic track, which is a bass track, which is from the famous TB303, an incredible acid bass, which is also partnered on the device with a really strong filter. So generally, on the T8, you only have 7 sounds, with some variation on some of them, rather than a choice of 7 amongst a larger library of dozens or 200 sounds, as in the case of the Volca. Within each pattern on the T8, you can have up to 32 steps, double what the Volca sample allows. On the T8, there is no chaining of patterns. There's no song construct. On the Volca Sample2, there is the ability to chain patterns, but just once, just one chain, and only of contiguous single patterns. So very limited indeed, but it is a song, I'll call it. Neither of the instruments has a scene construct, but I left that in the model since other devices do have scenes. Now, there's one more construct within step that I think is important to mention, particularly here, and that is repeats per step, sub-steps. On the Volca sample, you have no sub-step that I can see, but on the T8, you have the ability to have up to 4 sub-steps, which does give you some variation and really good options. So that's the content structure, and mostly the differences between the two is basically capacity rather than significant differences which would impact workflow. But there are definitely some feature differences that create workflow implications. So let's get into the feature differences that I felt had an impact on my impressions of the two devices and my use of the two devices. Remember, this is not an exhaustive list of feature haves and have-nots. It's just a select few that I would point out if someone asked about the ones that impacted my experience with the T8 and the Volca Sample2. First, we'll start with price, of course. $149 USD for the Volca Sample2 and $199 new for the T8. Patterns is a pretty big difference. You have 16 patterns, each with 16 steps on the Volca Sample2, and you have 64 patterns, each with 32 steps on the T8. Polyphony is available on both, and I guess you don't need to worry too much about it because it's barely even mentioned on the T8 documentation. In the Korg documentation, they say it's got 8-voice polyphony on the sample too. And the T8, from what I can tell, has 6 or 7-voice polyphony so that all of the tracks can be on any one step. Now, sound choice is a big difference. On the sample 2, you can choose from 200 sample sounds and put those on any of the 10 tracks. On the T8, you have very limited sound choice. It's actually, that's why I called it opinionated. There are basically 7 tracks and you get 1 sound per track, and you can't really change the underlying sound except for a few exceptions, and you have to menu dive to actually change those. But the T8 has minimal sound choice. Keyboard mode is a big deal for me. On the Sample 2, there is no way to record melodic sounds using a keyboard structure. You actually have to go into each step and change the speed of the sample to match the note that you want to play. That's somewhat annoying when you're trying to make a melodic sample. On the T8, you do have a keyboard mode, and so you can do note recording using a keyboard. Now, of course, you can plug in a MIDI keyboard to either device, and that is not that big of a hassle, so you can get around it. But if you're only carrying this device with you, I would much rather create a melodic pattern on the T8 than I would on the Sample 2. Motion recording is available on the Sample 2, but not on the T8. However, on the T8, you actually have some step parameters that you can change really easily. Slide, probability, substeps, accents, ties. And so I would say these two have similar capabilities, but the T8 actually has more options, even though you can do motion recording on the Sample 2. There's some sound design capability in both devices. There's nothing that special about either one in this area, but I would say the big difference on the T8 is that TB303 bass sound. There are some really strong filter controls there that I just love. That might be a personal preference more than anything else, so I'm not holding it against the Sample 2. There is no audio in on the Sample 2. But on the T8, there is an audio in that mixes with the audio out. It does not run through the effects on the T8, but at least you can take something and chain it from another device. And I think the intention there is that the other Aira Compact devices can be pushed through one device. So you can chain them and mix the audio in with the out of the next device. The next one is a biggie, autosave. Neither the Volca Sample nor the T8 have autosave, but there's a massive difference in the way they work. On the Volca Sample 2, when you switch patterns, you are literally loading a new pattern in memory and losing any work you did on the prior pattern unless you explicitly save it, or they call it write it first. On the T8, you have to power the device off to lose your work. So you still have to remember to save or write the patterns, but you can work across several patterns without losing your work if you don't write. In other words, you can switch patterns and still have all your patterns saved in memory. You can't do that on the Volca. And you can save all your patterns at once. So before powering down, you still need to remember to do that, but at least it's one step. I still want autosave on both devices. The next is MIDI. Now, on the Sample 2, it's called MIDI in. There's only one port. And I've seen indications that there are hacks to get MIDI out, but I still can't figure out how to do it. And on the T8, you get both MIDI in and MIDI out. Effects are slightly different as well. On the Sample2, you have delay, reverb, and what they call an isolator. There are two knobs, a bass and treble knob, that affect the whole mix. On the T8, you get delay, reverb, overdrive, even sidechain, and the bass filter. I'll call that an effect because it's really heavily used, at least in my patterns. Now, there is no song mode on the T8, and on the Volca Sample2, I'll call it a song, but basically you can chain patterns, but they have to be contiguous, and you only get to repeat the pattern once. So it's sort of one song, but slightly better than the T8, but not much. And the T8 basically has no song mode. When you load patterns, just like saving patterns is so different between the two devices, loading is also different. You get no quantized pattern load on the Volca Sample2. You have to time it right. On the T8, it is quantized when you load a new pattern. So the T8 is way better for performance if you're going to perform many patterns. And it gives you the ability to vary the patterns so many times because you've got 64 patterns. Size-wise, the two are both very mobile. One is 13 ounces and about 1 3/4 inches high, and the other is 11 ounces and just about 1 5/8 high. So they're both very travel friendly. So those are the main feature differences that I have really felt when using these devices. If I had to pick those that have the biggest impact on me, that would be the following. First, on the Volca Sample. A big plus is the sound choice. There's so many sounds to choose from, 200 sounds. The minuses are no keyboard recording. It's just so tedious. And yes, I will plug a MIDI keyboard in if I need to. Not a huge deal. The other minus, of course, is no autosave, and the way that the Volca Sample2 handles that has tripped me up literally every single time I use the device. I always lose work. On the T8, the big things are, first, the plus, 64 patterns. That's massive for me. The keyboard recording, I really use all the time. And step parameter workflow is really easy for slides and probability and substeps. I feel like I use those features more because they're easy and accessible. And the minus, of course, is the lack of sound choice. You have to love the sounds that are coming out of this device, or it's not the device for you. Another minus, I will say, for the T8 is menu diving. Oh my gosh, there are so many items to menu dive. I can't believe how hard it is to get to some things as simple as copying a pattern. That's deep inside the menu. So that's the big picture, feature comparison, and sound structure differences. For $50 more, I prefer the T8 actually. One very likely scenario here is pairing the two rather than comparing the two. So the sequencer benefits of the T8 can use the sound benefits of the Sample2. Both devices are super portable and battery powered, and if you're looking for a sample box that can be played from another source or a way to make quick 16-step beats which are not heavy on the melodic side, the Sample2 might really work well for you. If you're looking for a quick drum pattern maker with plenty of room for loads of pattern variations, and you crave the TB303 bass as your only melodic sound with a really gnarly filter sweep, the T8 might be your box. Either way, you're gonna have fun.